Hello and welcome to the 2021 Winter Ag Workshop Series. Today we have maple sugaring and we will be joined by Eric and Carey from the Parker Dam State Park. So first we have a little bit of housekeeping. If you have not taken the pretest, the link is in the chat box. Please do that. It helps us see how much you learn and if this is helpful. In addition, your video and audio will be off for the rest of the session. However, there is a chat box. So if you need to share anything with the group or with the presenters, feel free to type it in the chat box or ask questions in the Q&A box. Now, if you want anything to be visible to everyone, so all the other attendees, please choose from the drop-down all panelists and attendees. So if you want to share resources, that's a great way to do it. And as a reminder, everything is public, so please be respectful. So with that, let's welcome Eric and Carey.
Hello, there we go. My name is Eric Rensel. I work at Parker Dam State Park. This is Carey Huber back here. We're going to keep our 6-foot distancing, but probably are going to take off our masks so you can see our mouths move a little better as things go on here. Parker Dam State Park is in northern Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. It's part of the Pennsylvania Wilds, and it is kind of rural. And as a state park, we are open year-round. And this time of year coming up real soon, we like to invite people to come and see our maple sugaring operation. This year, things are a little different because of COVID-19. There is going to be no in-person maple sugaring programs. Big sad face there. But we are going to be doing some virtual stuff. So what I'm going to do in the chat is provide both Carey's and my email address and some links to our calendar of events so that you guys can be aware of what's being offered. And I'll also share some links later on about some of the details we have on our maple sugaring operation as well. That said, I'm going to turn it over to Carey, and I'm going to have him put this on. This is our little Bluetooth microphone and speaker so we can hear you guys, or at least Cassidy. And also, we are probably going to be doing a few chat storms. If you've not done that before, we'll ask you to type in to the chat a response, but not hit enter until I say go. And that way we can get a really good look at everybody's response at the same time. That said, as I'm handing this over to Carey, the first chat storm is going to be where you're from and what grade level you teach. All right, so get that typed into the chat, but don't hit enter until I say go. All right.
All right. Get the mask off so it's a little bit clearer for everybody. And whenever you guys start seeing icicles on the nose or us shivering, just send warm thoughts this way because it's a little chilly here today. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like Eric said, in the late winter, early spring, March is maple sugaring season for us here at Parker Dam State Park. And typically we have in-person programming for the public on weekends. And we've been doing distance learning with school groups in their classrooms for the past several years, the same way we're doing with you guys, except previously we had been doing via Skype. We're transitioning towards Teams and other platforms like that, but trying to get people out to the Sugar Shack if they can't be here physically to kind of experience that rite of spring, which is maple sugaring. So, Eric, are you ready for?
Yep. Go ahead and go.
Go ahead and let us know where you're from and what grade levels you teach. Eric's going to take a quick scan of that. We always like to kind of see what folks are experience with it is or where they might be heading for it. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk to you a lot of the content that we cover in the public program and the distance learning program, but also a lot of how what we're doing is kind of connecting and hitting certain points. We know that everybody likes those cross-curricular things, so where you can touch on math and history, geography and social studies, English, all sorts of different things that you can touch on while teaching about maple sugaring and maple syrup. So, how to look for a good range of folks?
Ely'sburg, Pittsburgh, Clearfield, Butler, New Middleburg, Duncansville. That's all over the state.
All over the state. Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you here, at least virtually today. Hopefully at some point you'll get a chance to come out to the park and experience the Sugar Shack. There's nothing to replace seeing the steam roll and getting a whiff of what's going on here whenever we're using the evaporator and making maple syrup. So it is something that if you get the opportunity in person, that's really fun. I'm going to give you another question, because this is how we always start out our public programs, is I ask folks the question, who has had pure maple syrup? So go ahead, everybody go ahead. If you've had it, yes or no, let Eric know whether or not you've, he's monitoring that chat, let him know whether or not you've ever tried pure maple syrup. When we do this at a program, for the most part, depending on the day, there's a fair number of folks that have had pure maple syrup, but there's also a fair number that have never had pure maple syrup. Some folks are not aware that syrup that you get in a bottle labeled Log Cabin or whatever label it has on it may not be pure maple syrup. So we're here to kind of let them know the grandness of pure maple syrup, or what we feel it is. And most people that have tried both, if they had their option, they usually say they would prefer that pure maple syrup.
I would say the majority say yes.
Yes, they have.
Who knows, though?
Okay, a couple no's. We'll have to kind of steer them in that direction to make sure they get to try some of that. But usually what I do is we start off talking about where it comes from. And a lot of folks will say, well, you have to have maple trees. Some people just might say trees. And so you explain that it's trees from the maple family. You could use just about any tree from the maple family. We'll talk about identifying them. But what you're taking is the sap. Now, some of the little buddies will come out and say, you get syrup right from the tree. Well, there's a pretty big process between tapping a tree and getting your syrup. And we're going to talk about all those ins and outs. But it's that sap from the tree. And it's that sap from the tree at a certain time of the year, and some other ins and outs about it, the little bit of details that we're going to talk about here today. But really, that sap is in the tree. We take this opportunity to talk about some biology, some tree biology. So most folks know the limbs and the branches to the trunk to the roots, how the roots bring in water and nutrients from the soil. The trunk is like the transport in the trees. A lot of times we talk about taking a sliver or a tree cookie. Some of you guys might have tree cookies that you use to demonstrate things. And if we were to take a small sliver of a tree and kind of look at it under a microscope, how it might look a little bit similar. We use this as a real basic demo. How it might be similar to a stack of straws, okay? If you're looking at it under a microscope, and how things are moving through the tree, up and down through the tree. And that sap is moving things through the tree. Out at the leaves, you have that process of photosynthesis going on, taking that sunlight, turning it into food for the tree, water and nutrients coming from the roots. Those things are moving. But what happens is those leaves are not going to be there all through the year. The tree can't make food in the wintertime when it doesn't have leaves. So that last bit of food that it creates from the sunshine at the end of the year, end of the growing season, before the leaves die and fall off, it sends down into the tree to be stored over the winter. It actually is stored in cells as starch in the tree. And what's special about maple trees is what happens then when you start to get those warm days in the springtime. So what's going to happen is that starch is going to turn into a sugar, and then that is going to get transported into the sap, which gets pushed up into the tree. The tree is moving that sap to kind of get jump started for the new growing season. It needs to get energy out to those buds so the tree can leaf out, and then that process of photosynthesis can occur during the growing season to create the food for the tree from the sunshine. So we talk a little bit about how that's moving. We need to then talk a little bit about where this can happen and when it can happen. So you can't just go out right now and tap a tree and expect to get sap. We talk about what the sap is made of. So if you had pure maple syrup, which we don't have any right here, we haven't been making anything yet this year. If you have pure maple syrup is about 67% sugar. When you have maple sap, if you have really good maple sap, you may have 3 or 4% sugar. So how are we getting from 3 or 4% sugar in the sap to the syrup? Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you're talking about that sap being 3 or 4% sugar, what's the majority of the rest of it? Well, most of it is water. So right now in this environment, what's water gonna, what kind of physical state is water gonna be in? And it's gonna be solid. It's gonna be frozen. It's below 32 degrees. There, Eric's making it snow here. So you have that water that's gonna be frozen. That sap is frozen in the tree. Nothing is moving through the tree. So what we need are those first warm days. And there are very specific temperatures. And it all has to do with that sugar being changed from the starch that it was stored over the winter in those cells in the tree. And so you're looking for daytime temperatures in the 40s, not just above freezing. It doesn't hit 33 and then the sap just runs. We need daytime temperatures up into the 40s and nighttime temperatures down into the 20s where things are refreezing. Basically, we talk about it being like a recharge. So things are getting pushed up through the trees and we need it to freeze again at night so that it can continue to push. If we were to have places where it got up above 40 degrees, the sap ran, eventually that sap is going to run, the quantity is going to go down and down and down, and then it's just sort of going to level out, and you're not going to get large quantities of a sap run. So that's why you're not doing maple sugaring, say, in wherever you have maple trees, say in North Carolina, Georgia, things like that, because they don't have the typical climate that we have of warm days, cool nights in the early springtime. You need those successive warm days and cool nights to continue to have sap runs time after time and after time for the course of several weeks in the springtime. So when you get your first warm days, your season may start. You may have 4, 6, if you're lucky, 8 weeks of a season till the leaves bud out, and that's your entire maple season. So we can talk about what places have both maple trees and those types of temperatures, that type of climate to be conducive to making maple syrup. Otherwise, it's not really worth it. If you had a place where it ran for a couple of days and then that was it, you wouldn't have the volume of sap necessary to make large quantities of syrup. And so the industry is located in places where that does occur. So we can talk about that a little bit. Now, what we also like to talk about is a little bit of the history of it. Now, a lot of folks may not understand quite where maple sugaring came from. Who got the first idea to do that? Well, like a lot of things, when the first Europeans came to North America, they learned some things from the Native Americans. And so what the Native Americans were doing is they were going off to what they would call their sugar woods. It was probably someplace different from where they had their camp or village through most of the year. They would go off to a place where there was a large number of sugar maple trees, the best trees for making maple syrup or maple sugar. And so they would go and they would put a gash in a tree. They would basically cut through the bark of the tree into what's the sapwood. So if you remember our tree cookie, outside you have the bark, and then just the first few inches under the bark is the sapwood, and then that heartwood in the center. If they could gash into that sapwood on those warm days, the sap would flow out. A lot of times they would stick a piece of bark or a piece of wood in that gash at the bottom of the V to make it drip away from the tree so it didn't just run down the bark. And they would fashion birch bark bowls. Now this one's made out of some paper that looks like birch bark. But they would fashion some bowls like that, place them below that gash, and start gathering the sap. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about. A lot of this is broken into segments of the process, tapping a tree, gathering sap, turning sap into syrup. Well, this is the sap gathering part where they were capturing it in the bowls. When those bowls filled, they would bring them back to the center of their sugar camp that they've established. And they would have a large hollowed out trough, basically a big wooden trough, dump it in there. And that's what they would use to remove water. So think about that. Most of the sap is water. We're trying to go from 3 or 4% sugar to 66% sugar. We have to concentrate it in some way. And the way we do that is by removing water. And so they put it in that trough, bowls back to the tree. And this happened for over the course of weeks during the springtime. You're talking an awful lot of work. And then we usually ask the question, how do you get rid of that water in that trough? Well, a lot of people right away, intuition tells you, you're going to boil it. Are you going to put a wooden trough over a fire? No, that's silly. We burn our wooden trough. And so what we talk about is those initial ways that they were doing it, where they would build a fire, but they would put rocks into the fire, take hot rocks out of the fire with sticks, put them into that trough. And I bet you guys can all picture putting a hot rock into a trough full of maple sap, and you're going to get little wisps of steam and a little bit of hissing, and you're going to get that water to evaporate very, very slowly, but that water will eventually evaporate. And that's what they were doing, is they were trying to create that evaporation to remove water. That's the best way to get rid of that water in the sap, concentrate the sugars, and make maple syrup or maple sugar, is to evaporate it. And they were doing it with hot rocks. Now think about that. Hot rocks are going to cool off. They go back into the fire, and it's back and forth with hot rocks for long periods of time during the springtime. But eventually they would get there, but they weren't making syrup. They didn't have a lot of good ways to store syrup. So they were actually removing more water than what we would do when we make syrup, and they were actually creating sugar. This is a little cake of maple sugar. It has more water removed from it than we would for our syrup. And so when it cools down, the sugars crystallize and create that little cake of sugar. Now that's something that they could wrap up, maybe animal skins, and keep throughout the year and use as a food source. A lot of times they would carve themselves out a little bowl or mold, whatever you want to call it. Well, it was still liquid, pour it in there, and again, it would crystallize as it cools. You could take those little cakes out, and you would have those to use. Now, when those first Europeans came and they saw them doing this, they thought, this is fantastic. Our sugar that we use comes from sugar cane. It has to come on the ships from places that are really warm, like the Caribbean. It's fairly expensive. It gets taxed. So this is something we could do in our backyard to create sugar. And so they kind of took that idea, ran with it, made some improvements. One of the first improvements they made, instead of gashing the trees, which are going to take a fairly long time to heal, they had braces and bits, types of drills, would drill into the tree. They figured out pretty quick that they could take certain tree twigs and hollow them out and carve themselves a little spout and stick that right into the tree, the hole that they made in the tree. The sap would drip out, and instead of having little birch bark bowls, they would probably have something like a wooden bucket that they would capture the sap in. The other big improvement that they had was that instead of using hot rocks to evaporate the water, they brought with them lots of implements to cook with. And so, yeah, Eric would be pretty excited to get away from the hot rocks and be able to trade for somebody to get a kettle that you could put right over the fire. You can get evaporation to occur much more quickly. You get that water driven off in the form of steam, and you get those sugars concentrated much, much more rapidly. And again, the same thing, they were using sugar. That's why we call it maple sugaring. We're at the sugar shack here at the park, because it wasn't about syrup. Syrup's only been the big deal for about 100 years or so. It was always about the sugar, a local source of sugar for folks. And so they would do the same thing, make that hard sugar and use it in those ways. Now, eventually they got some metal buckets, some metal spiles, some ways to make things a little bit more easy on themselves. But the really big thing was in about the mid-1800s, around the time of the Civil War or so. If you think about this kettle with sap boiling in it, the evaporation occurs at the surface. So you're heating up all that volume. The evaporation is at the surface. You're losing that steam. You're driving that water away. All good. But they thought about it, and somebody came up with the idea, what if we made a big, wide, flat pan with more surface area for that water to evaporate? And that was one of the first evaporator pans. You'll see a modern version of an evaporator when Eric takes you inside the sugar shack. And what that does is it is making the process more efficient. A lot of maple sugaring is pretty much the same as it's been since the beginning. You have one thing you need, the maple sap. You're going to do one thing to it. You're going to get rid of that water and concentrate the sugars. But how you get to those points has become more and more efficient over the years. And that was the first big thing, was those evaporator pans. And Eric will show you how that works on a modern evaporator. but the idea was to get rid of that water as quickly as possible. The other big thing happened in the mid-1900s, and that was collection. Now, if you had a wooden bucket to collect in, a metal bucket, at one point we have some plastic buckets, some bags, different ways to gather and collect sap, but you could only use so many of them because the sap is going to run when those temperatures are right. And when you have a day of a sap run, you could fill up one of these buckets in the course of a day, and you need to empty them or else you're losing precious sap. And so you needed the manpower to go through, empty the buckets, and gather your sap. So you could only be as big as your workforce could handle. So you couldn't be really huge, but the industry was able to really grow and produce much more volume whenever they were able to make plastic pipeline and some of the plastic fittings and such that go with it, because with plastic pipeline, take this big piece of plastic out, you can see how flexible some of these can be. So if you're going to make a pipeline, which they always thought was a good idea for collecting sap, if you're going to make a pipeline, the only thing you had were metal and wood before the plastic, and everything would be hard plumbed into a line. And when we talk about tapping a tree, you can't tap the same hole year after year. It creates scar tissue. You have to move to a new spot. So you would have an awful lot of work to replumb a hard system like that. Being flexible, you could move the tap from one side of the tree one year, around the tree to the other side another year, and keep that location of that tap moving. And you would be able to use these pipelines and create a whole system of collection. So instead of maybe several hundred, or maybe you had a couple of thousand trees on your farm or your property where you were gathering with buckets, with pipelines, you could now be in the 10,000, 20,000.
So you might say it revolutionized the sugaring industry?
It was probably a revolution to the industry, I would say, yes. And so some of the big producers in Pennsylvania today are 80,000, 90,000 taps. So think about a bucket full of sap coming from each tap every day, multiply that times 80,000 and how much sap they have coming in. So then that also lends to some of the things in the sugar shack that make the process more efficient, like bigger evaporators, more efficient evaporators, because when that sap's coming in, you have to use it. You have to get that concentrated and boiled down into syrup fairly quickly. And so that was a pretty big revolution in the sugaring industry. But it's, again, the same idea. You're taking maple sap and you're removing water, and you're creating that sugar or the syrup, depending on what product you're looking at creating through the process at your sugar woods or in your backyard. One of the things we like to do here is show a small version of a modern operation, which we are here at the park. We are using some of the modern technologies on a fairly small scale, but we also like to talk to people about how you could do it in the driveway, your backyard, because it's a really fun thing to kind of learn and do in the springtime and to kind of try the process out. For us, it's a rite of spring here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to real briefly talk to you about identifying trees. This is another one of those sort of the science part of the lesson is we're going to talk about identifying a maple tree, because right now there are no leaves on the tree. And that's how most people identify trees, is by the leaves. But you can also look at bark. You can look at buds. You can look at the arrangement of the branches is what we're going to take a look at. So I'm going to kind of wander this way. Eric's going to move the camera a little bit. We'll come to one of our maple trees. And so most of the trees in Pennsylvania, most of the native trees, are going to be alternately arranged, meaning as you go out a branch, the twigs are going to be alternate. On the right side to start, then out a little further on the left, and out a little further on the right, alternating back and forth as you got the branch or up the trunk. There are some that are oppositely branched, and not a lot. So we remember those opposite branched ones. They're going to have branches or twigs that come out directly across from one another. They're opposite through an acronym we call MAD horse, and that just stands for maples, ashes, dogwoods, and horse chestnut. Those families, those trees are the ones that we're going to find that are oppositely arranged. And the two main ones that are going to be big enough, because we need a certain size diameter to tap a tree, there's only two that we're really going to mistake for one another whenever it's big enough to be tapped, which is about 10 to 12 inches in diameter. We want a tree about 10 to 12 inches in diameter before we think about tapping it. And if it's that size and it has opposite branches, we're going to confirm it with the bark. Now, the two tree families that could be that in our woods would be maples and ashes. If you're familiar with the invasive insect, the emerald ash borer, we basically don't have very many, if at all, living ashes anymore. But when you come over and you look at the bark, this one's fairly smooth and gray. It's just starting to mature and get some of these rough patches that are indicative of a mature maple tree. You'll see some more of that rough bark when we go up into the sugar wood. When it gets fully mature, it almost looks like some of those could be peeled off. An ash tree, which would be the other one we're trying to differentiate from, they're very tight bark. It doesn't look like any of those rough furrows could be peeled off. The maple, a little more so. So that's how we're going to identify them. And then what we need to do once we identify the tree is go and tap them. So since it's a little early, we're not actually going to tap a tree so that, again, once you tap a tree, you're causing an injury. After a certain amount of time, bacteria will start to heal over that wound in the tree. It won't produce the sap. And so we don't want to be tapped in too early before the sap starts running. Based on the weather conditions here, we have a few weeks before we start getting some good temperatures, but it'll be quite a while. But what we want to do is we're going to go up in the woods. We'll show you a mature tree. We'll talk briefly about tapping it, and then we'll come back down and show you what we do once we've gathered the sap, which all happens inside the sugar shack.
Right. And as we move away, I'm probably going to lose the chat function until I get my hotspot back down here. So if you're chatting and I'm not responding, that's why.
So we're heading up into our sugar woods here. Probably would have been a good idea to have snowshoes on today. And we'll stop and take a look at this first tree here. Now, any of you that are really good looking at video and identifying trees, you're probably going to right away say, well, that's not a sugar maple tree. And you're right. This is a red maple tree. We can use any of the trees in the maple family. Some are better than others. Sugar maples tend to have about 3 or 4% sugar in their sap. Red maples, maybe 1.5 to 2%, less as you go through other species. But why we're using red maples is because that's what we have here in our sugar woods. There are some sugar maples in the park, but red maple is by far what we have the highest concentration of right here, where it's easy to interpret the process. So if you look at that bark, it's pretty rough. We're probably in that 14-inch diameter range. We're bigger than that 10 to 12 inches. We want to make sure it's a mature tree before we tap it. We've got that rough bark. You'll even see a couple of old scar holes here and there. There's a really old one over here, a couple there. Those are indicative if you're in a place that's been sugaring for a long time, because you know that tree's been tapped before. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill into that tree, and we're going to hang a bucket, or we may use pipeline. Before we go back down the hill, Eric will pan over to the rest of the woods. You'll see some blue line hanging. It's not going to be stretched tight yet because we haven't tapped in our trees. So that would be the pipeline that we use to gather sap. We have some of our trees on the pipeline and some of them on buckets. But whenever we get to the tree we're going to tap, we're going to drill in, and we're going to drill in no more than about 2.5 inches. So you can see on this tree cookie how far we're going in. We're staying in that sapwood, staying away from the heartwood. That's so that we can continue this process and be sustainable over time. Because if we were to drill right into the heartwood, we're kind of opening up that part of the tree that isn't living anymore. There's no sap flowing through the heartwood. It can't heal itself in there. Makes it susceptible to insects, disease, fungus. That's why a lot of times you have hollow trees. The heartwood has been attacked. And so in the sapwood, the tree can recover, and we can do this time after time. On some farms, they've been sugaring the same trees for over 100 years, and the tree is still a viable tree. So we go in about 2.5 inches. We're going to tap in a spile or spout, hang the bucket from it, and wait for that very important temperature change of 40 degrees during the day, 20 degrees at night. We'll get our sap runs. We'll get our buckets to fill up, or the sap to be flowing through the pipeline over here, and then it's going to go down and be collected in a tank at the back of the sugar shack. So Eric's going to go ahead and pan over, show you a little bit of that pipeline. As we go past the sugar shack, you'll see the tank at the back where the pipeline's running to. And then we'll kind of switch gears from talking about gathering sap into processing it in to the syrup or the sugar that we're looking for. We'll kind of switch off here with the yeehaw.
All right. Well, hello. Morning. This is our sugar shack at Parker Dam State Park. My name again is Eric, and I've been sugaring here. Well, goodness gracious, I've been sugaring since the 60s, doing programs since I want to say the mid 70s or 80s. I forget now. And we've moved a couple different times, but this is pretty fancy now. We have some pretty nice things, including our evaporator. The tank you saw out back holds about 300 gallons of sap. So once we get a good volume in that, we'll fill our evaporator. And I'm just going to bring this over and kind of show you what's going on here right now. This is our evaporator. The pipes you see in the back there feed down into a float, which would sit in that tank right over there. And this is what they call a drop flue evaporator. You can see that there are troughs down in the bottom. That boils 10 times faster than a flat pan. And this is the front pan. This is where the syrup gets made. But what happens is that follows a long kind of sinuous path. The sap flows in 1/2 of that in the back into the flue pan, and that flue pan boils things very fast. And what happens is that sap drops down into those troughs, and the fire goes through between the troughs. So that boils very quickly. It flows through and then floats into the front pan, and you saw the compartments in the front too. The longer that goes, the more concentrated that sap becomes until it becomes syrup. Again, you're trying to get rid of water, and this evaporator can boil, I want to say it's like 35, 40 gallons of sap an hour. Is that right? Yes. Okay. So we can get rid of 35 or 40 gallons of steam in 1 hour's time. And it takes us about 65 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So there's a big volume, a big difference there. But the work part of it is gathering the sap, whether it's teams of horses or tractors or carrying buckets or pipelines, doing all that. The finesse actually happens in here. Because as you know, if you're boiling things on a stove and you're not paying attention just for that moment, it can boil over. If you guys have made candy before, let me get rid of this mask. If you guys have made candy before, you understand what that's like, or you boiled macaroni. For you guys who are boiling macaroni on a stove, there's some tricks that you can use, right? A little bit of butter, or some people lay a spoon across. But basically, you're using a little bit of fat content or oil to break the surface tension to drop the boil. That can happen, and it will happen in an evaporator if you're not paying attention. There's some ins and outs of that, but the old timers used to keep a pitcher of cream. This happens to be empty, but it's there as a prop. A pitcher of cream, so that when the boil did start to rise, you could just dip your fingers in, flick a few drops of cream in, and it would drop the boil. It would break that surface tension and drop the boil. If you didn't do that, it boiled over, it burned your pan, ruined the syrup, and you got in a lot of trouble if it was your dad's evaporator. Not that that ever happened here, but old timers would sometimes hang a string of bacon fat just down below the bottom surface. So if the boil rose up and they weren't paying attention, it would hit the fat and automatically drop the boil again. Nowadays, we use something called sap defoamer. Sap defoamer is highly concentrated surface tension breaker liquid. We add a few drops to the back pan about every time. Normally would throw wood to it, but this is a gas-fired evaporator, which is really sweet, I gotta say. So about every 5 to 10 minutes, you'd put a drop or two in just to make sure that that boil stays down. As it gets closer to syrup, how can you tell that it's syrup? Well, the old timers would just dip a scoop in and watch how it sheeted off the end of the scoop, much like when you're making candy and you can see how things sheet or drop. And I can usually get pretty close by watching that consistency, that viscosity, but there's a few other ways too. And one would be to measure the temperature. Using a thermometer, it could be candy thermometer, it could be a dial thermometer, but maple syrup boils at 7.5 degrees or 7 degrees higher than the boiling temperature of water. Well, what's the boiling temperature of water? Well, are you at sea level? What's the barometric pressure? It varies. So as your barometric pressure varies, so does the boiling temperature of water and your syrup. So if I were using that method, I would measure the boiling temperature of water at that location, add 7 degrees, and that would be the boiling temperature of pure maple syrup. Okay, so remember that. The most consistent way that most folks use now is something called a hydrometer. This is kind of an essential tool, as far as I'm concerned, if you're making syrup. It's a fancy glass float, and it's measured, or it's calibrated to measure the exact density of hot maple syrup or cold maple syrup, but would basically fill our testing cup with what we're hoping is syrup. We would slide that in carefully, not dropping it. When it floats to the red line right there, I know I have exactly the density of syrup that I need. The reason that that's important is because if you don't take the maple syrup far enough, if you don't get it to the proper density, it can spoil over time. If you take it too far, that's not as bad, but you'll get like rock hard crystals. It looks like broken glass in the bottom of your containers, which is crystallized sugar. But if you get it the exact right density, using a hydrometer, that's a pretty easy way to do it. That syrup is basically going to last forever. You know, what's the only food source that never goes bad? They say honey. Well, I disagree. I would throw in maple syrup too, because it never really does go bad if it's at the right density. By law, it has to weigh 11 pounds a gallon, and it has to be that kind of measures that sugar density. And it also has to be graded. Well, grading is basically how strong a flavor it is, how dark the color it is. And that is a factor of how long it's been on the fire. When you caramelize things, it kind of colors them up a little bit. Maple syrup's the same way. The longer it's been exposed to heat, the more it caramelizes. The stronger the flavor, the more intense the flavor. So you would think that people would like that strong syrup, but honestly, it's kind of a trick to get it as light a grade as possible. And there's a couple ways of doing that. One, if it's a good sweet sap, if it's high in sugar, it stands to reason that it's not going to need to stay on the evaporator as long. So it would have less exposure to that heat and would be a lighter grade of syrup. That's tough to do, and it's a little fancy. Most people like the medium to dark and sometimes the extra dark. Later on in the season, when there's not as much sugar in the sap, it takes longer to boil, and so later season you tend to get the darker, stronger, more robust flavors, which are great for cooking, but not so good for making candy. If you want to make candies, you want the lighter stuff. So there are other methods of getting rid of water. The evaporator here works fairly fast. I said I can boil 35 or 40 gallons of sap an hour, but if I have 2,000 trees tapped, I'm never going to keep up with this. I would need to get a bigger evaporator or a couple of evaporators or do something a little different. And the big producers today are using something called reverse osmosis. You can get reverse osmosis units for under your sink. It purifies your tap water. It gets rid of the impurities, so only the pure water comes through. We're using that same technology. You can do the reverse. You can let the pure water pass through those reverse osmosis membranes where you're concentrating the things, the impurities. In this case, in the sap, it's going to be sugar, calcium, magnesium, all the things you want in your syrup. So by running a reverse osmosis system, you can remove 75% of the water from the sap before it ever goes into the evaporator. And that's going to save you time, it's going to save you fuel, and it's going to end up with a lighter grade of syrup. Over on this back wall, I'm going to pan over this way a little bit. We have a kind of a scale model reverse osmosis. All right. So what I have is I have a feed line coming down into my viewing tube. The viewing tube right here is kind of like one of those big coffee urns. When I open the valves, the sap in the tank will seek the same level as that tube. And so I can see how much sap is in there. That's great. That also gives me access to run my RO. So I have a hose down in there. I'll plug it in, and I have a high pressure pump over here that pumps that sap through a pre-filter. The pre-filter is to get rid of any debris or things that might actually harm the reverse osmosis membranes themselves, because we only want pretty much clean sap hitting those. From there, it goes into that first RO. The water passes through, drops down into a tube, and gets gone. It gets actually sent up to a small tank in the rafters up here. We save about 20 gallons of it for flushing out our system at the end. But we're just dumping that purified water right out the back. We really don't need it, and that's what we're trying to get rid of. Although if you're thirsty, you can go around and stand with your mouth open. But the concentrated stuff then goes up into the next RO, and the next, and into the next, until it, in turn, goes up into a tank that sits up here, and this blue tube feeds down from that tank. So we can take our concentrated stuff, our concentrate sap, and send it into the evaporator, and it will go through the evaporator much more quickly. And so again, it's going to save us a lot of time and fuel. Primarily, that's the great thing there. When you get it to syrup, when you get it exactly to syrup, you need to get it off there and bottle it, right? I mean, you're not going to have it in your evaporator forever. So, Carey, if you want to pan that over this way. We will draw off from that one side of our evaporator, and with all the different troughs in there, if we stretched it out, that'd be like 20 feet long. So you put fresh sap in one end, and the other end gets as concentrated as it's going to be. We'll test the syrup there. When we get it to syrup, we'll draw it off into a pail, we'll filter it, and put it into our canning tank. This allows us to bottle it or can it while it's hot. We filter it, used to use these old felt filters. They make wonderful hats, but it's only a cosmetic thing. Pure maple syrup has magnesium, calcium, sugar sands, or niter, and that stuff will settle out to the bottom of the jar and look like so much dark gunk. So it's customary to filter it out, filter out the niter. Not bad for you, you can eat it, but it just doesn't look good. Felt filters clog up. It takes a long time to get through there, but that's what a lot of folks use. Well, a couple of years ago, we invested in a filter press. And the filter press, let me turn this over this way a little bit, actually puts the syrup through under pressure. And it's much faster, and it actually makes a much cleaner looking syrup. And in this case, these are clear plastic resin filters. So the syrup would get pumped into this chamber, press up against the paper, and drop into the waffle cone here and go through. And we're also using food grade diatomaceous earth and adding that to the syrup, because it's actually the diatomaceous earth that's filtering the niter out of the syrup, not the papers. The paper's going to filter the diatomaceous earth, which filters then the niter. In any case, it's a much cleaner, much nicer way to go. Once we get that into our canning tank, then we will bring it up to temperature. You want it about 190 degrees, somewhere in that way, or that temperature range, because when you add it into the bottle, it needs to be hot to kill any bacteria or germs that might be inside that bottle. Okay, so we'll fill the bottle up, we'll screw the lid on tight, we'll lay the bottle on its side so that hot syrup can contact all parts of that. Once it's cooled, we set it down and call it good. What we'll also do is draw off a batch into our grading kit. Okay, and what a grading kit is, actually, let me turn this around so you can see out the door here a little bit. The grading kit is different colors. Okay, so I would take my syrup sample and I would put it down in there and I'd do a little color comparison. If it was lighter than this one, but darker than this one, that would be a grade A medium. Grade A dark, and if it's darker than the darkest one we have here, it's grade A extra dark. It used to be called grade B, but grade B doesn't sound as good as grade A, even though in some respects it's even better. It's got more maple flavor, and that's what a lot of people want. So we bottle it, we label it, because by rights it has to be labeled as to the grade and where it was made. And then we sell it. And actually we do sell it here at Parker Dam. We give samples away when people come out for public programs, which, sad to say, isn't going to happen this year, so you're going to miss that aspect of it. But any syrup that we make, we give. Often if we have guest speakers coming in that say, no, I don't want paid, you offer them a half pint of syrup and they're like, yeah, can I come back next year? So good thing to do. But from there, it's educational in that we use it for, well, we also Skype or Zoom, or I guess in the near future here, Microsoft Teams, to schools. We've been doing Skyping to schools for about 4 years now with the equipment that we have here. So what we do is we talk to the different schools, have them set up a date and a time, and we provide the link, or if you want to use Zoom, you can provide the link to us. But prior to that session, we will send maple syrup, sample cups, and some props so that you can have those in your classroom. And so when you get to the end of the program, everybody can have a sample of syrup that was made right here. Those have been very popular. And well, it happened. We were just getting into the swing of things in 2020, and you know what happened. And schools got canceled and our whole program fell out. So we're looking forward to doing that again this year. So if you are interested, shoot us an email, and I will post our emails and some other links here in the chat in a moment. But I'm going to give the mic back to Carey to answer any final questions and to kind of do a wrap up, and I will put those into the chat. And we're about 10 till, so if you guys have questions, stick them in the chat. This way.
All right. Let's turn this up just a little there. So again, whenever, depending on, what age level you're teaching, what subject you might be teaching, maple sugaring could fit the bill for that, or you could team teach some stuff. There are resources out there for, I think one of the state maple associations has a maple math worksheet. You can do some of the maple math, because when you're talking about multiplying the number of taps and the volume of sap that you're getting and what you're going to get percentage-wise in syrup, there's a lot of good math out there. Or if you're, some of the ag teachers that have project books going on, a kid could do a whole section on accounting for their maple as a business type of a deal. You've got geography and social studies, some history, English. Typically, at the end of a public program, Eric has a poem that he reads. We have a couple of story books for elementary kids that we sometimes use with maple. So there's a lot of different things that can kind of come together when you're talking about maple syrup. And it's, again, obviously very heavy on the science part of it. And we can talk very detailed. We've had college level dendrology classes out and talked about the process, and that becomes a much more detailed discussion than, say, perhaps a third grade class that just kind of wants to know the process and hey, you're getting it from the trees and what the basics are. So there's a big range of things that can occur with the maple, teaching it in the classroom. And again, use that chat if we can help you in some way figure out how to incorporate this. I know years ago some teachers would do the thing where they tapped the tree in the schoolyard. They had a hot plate or something in the classroom where they would boil it down. I know that's something that's probably a way big no-no nowadays. But there were ways to kind of get that process in and talk to the traditions of maple sugaring in the springtime.
We do have a question here. It says, what kind of training did you take or do for this job? And did it occur naturally because you worked for sugaring beforehand, or did you learn sugaring on this job?
So for myself, and I think Eric's probably a lot the same way, it was on the job. Learning, because I started working here at the park in the first winter. It was need to learn how to make maple syrup and learn that process. And over the course of about 15 years for me, for Eric a little bit longer, it's you learn a lot of those ins and outs. You make mistakes. You talk to a lot of other folks. There's a lot of great resources out there. There are equipment providers and other producers and things like that to go talk to. But it's kind of getting your feet wet and trying it and doing it. It's experiential.
Okay. Are there any ways to protect maple tree that has been tapped? In other words, once you pull the taps, probably.
So a lot of people think you need to plug the hole, do something to help the tree. The tree is going to heal on its own. So you've tapped the tree. If you've followed the guidelines, you didn't put in too many taps to a tree. Usually it's one tap unless it's over 2 feet in diameter. Then you might think about 2, maybe 2 if it's got a double trunk. But you put in one tap. You only went in 2 to 2.5 inches. You followed those guidelines. When you pull that spile at the end of the season, that tree is going to be able to heal itself. Now you're still going to see a hole there for a couple of years. Remember, trees grow out. So eventually new growth will go over that and you'll still see those scars there for a while. I mentioned that earlier, didn't really touch on it up in the woods, but you want to avoid those old scar holes because there's scar tissue around there where the sap no longer flows through that tree's plumbing, so to speak. But it'll eventually grow over those old holes and you don't need to do anything to sort of help that or complement that.
Well, those are the questions that we have. I did send out those links. Some of them are videos that we've done here for some of the details. There's also links to our email addresses and links to our calendar of events and Hills Creek, because Hills Creek State Park also does maple sugaring, and they're virtual as well. And as far as lesson plans, if you would just simply Google maple sugaring lesson plans, there's lots of good stuff out there. You guys can be the judge of what's good or what isn't. But I looked today just because I was going to maybe include some links, but there's so many good ones. I thought, you just Google and look for yourself. And finally, we do have a document here that talks about academic standards. And so what we've done is gone through and tried to corroborate or coordinate all those academic standards with everything that you could possibly teach with maple sugaring. If you want a copy of that document, just shoot us an email and we can send it back that way. We did have another question come in.
Sure.
Can any other trees be tapped, like walnut?
So there are other tree species. So by far, the maple family is the one that gets all the notoriety because of the, I'll call it the efficiency of it. So Eric mentioned we need 65 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup because we're using red maple. It's a little less if you have a sugar maple tree, which is higher in sugar content, 35 to 40 gallons maybe. You get to other species of maple and you're talking 90 gallons of sap, 100 gallons, and other tree species. Some folks do with birch and other tree species. Again, it's a very, very, very large volume of sap comparatively to make 1 gallon of syrup. So it can be done. I think we even heard of one, somebody where they didn't have the climate. They were taking some apple cider, perhaps, I think I heard, and then boiling that and trying to create an apple flavored syrup, a cider syrup. So there are other things going on with other species, but it's the efficiency of the maple.
All right, and I'm not sure about walnut being tapped.
I think I did hear that. There's a list of them out there. If you do a Google search, there's a list of a lot of tree species. So yeah.
And I've seen hickory syrup as well, but that's not something from tapping a tree. You're actually taking the bark, simmering that, and then adding sugar and cooking it down.
It's basically distilling that flavor and then adding it to a sugar. So if you look at the ingredients, if it says sugar or water, that type, they're putting a flavor to that. If you look at a bottle of Log Cabin or something, you got the high fructose corn syrup, and then maybe 1 or 2% of real maple flavor sometimes. So you have to kind of be on the watch.
All right. Well, no other questions coming in. Cassidy, do you have any other questions or comments? I see the post test is up. You guys do well.
Yes, please take the post test. I think I heard all the answers, so should be good. And we will also send out the resource sheet with the email tomorrow that includes all the links that Eric shared. So with that, thank you both so much. And thank you everyone else who attended.
Welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.